Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, 7 locally transmitted malaria cases have been reported in the U.S. since May, 6 here in Florida and 1 in Texas. And this is the first time in a couple of decades since this has happened. Now, the species of malaria that has been identified is Plasmodium vivax, and this is one of 5 Plasmodium species that can infect humans. So, what is malaria? What is Plasmodium vivax? How important is this transmission and how surprising, and how to prevent it? These and other questions will be posed to my guest today. Joining me today is Brian Grimberg, PhD. Dr. Grimberg is an associate professor with the Department of Pathology at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine, and he is a prominent malaria researcher. Dr. Grimberg, welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Okay, so we have these unusual locally acquired malaria cases in Florida and Texas. It's received a lot of media attention. As a malaria expert, how surprised were you to hear of this? Was it expected or not surprised at all?
Well, it's really a numbers game with so many people traveling and so many insects still here in the United States. The mosquitoes that transmit malaria never left. We just interrupted the transmission cycle back in the 50s because to get malaria, an infected person has to be bit by a mosquito who flies away for 2 weeks and then has to bite another person. So if you interrupt at any point along that chain, then you've totally interrupted the malaria transmission. So you can kill all the bugs or kill enough bugs or prevent enough people from being bitten by having them wear bug spray or be indoors or sleep under bed nets. And if you interrupt that transmission cycle anywhere, then you completely disrupt malaria. But still, with as many people traveling abroad, and I think with COVID really taking the front seat, the world has sort of forgotten about malaria for a little while, and it's been on the rise since COVID took over.
Yeah, and concerning right here in Florida, there's several different species of Anopheles mosquitoes, which can transmit malaria. And so far this year, there's been a couple dozen of travel-associated malaria cases, so this should not be a surprise. However, mosquito control in Florida is pretty good, which has probably been one of the greatest preventers of local malaria over the past decade or two.
For sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Now, this being a recurring issue, and the reason I ask you that is in 2009, dengue fever was reported. Another mosquito-borne pathogen was reported in Key West, and that was the first time in 40 years. But since 2009, we see it on a pretty regular basis here in Florida.
Right.
Are we expecting something like that with malaria, or?
I don't think so, because we've got pretty good treatments for malaria, and now that people are more aware of it, I think that the likelihood of continuing spread is probably pretty low. We have good methods to treat malaria, like I said, but where we don't have good methods to treat dengue and say Zika. It's another one that was spread in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead and just talk about malaria itself, just to give the audience a primer on this parasitic disease. What is malaria?
So malaria is a parasite that is transmitted by mosquitoes, and it grows within the liver of a patient for about 2 weeks after being bitten by an infected mosquito, and then it bursts forth, and you're not sick at all during that liver stage. You don't even feel it or know it. But then it bursts forth and infects. It's a little tiny parasite that infects your red blood cells only, and they grow, and then they burst, and they grow, and they infect new red blood cells, sort of on a repeating cycle, and that's what gives you the fevers. And especially for this species of malaria vivax, you get this cyclic fever, and that's when the bursting of the parasites coming forth out of your red blood cells sort of trigger this quick rise in temperature, and then it fades. And so it happens sort of at night and in morning. So basically it happens when mosquitoes would be biting you. They sort of synced up to them. Then when a mosquito bites, they need to get both a male and female form of the parasite, of the sexual stage of the parasite. Then it grows in their gut, and then it comes out into their salivary glands about 2 weeks later and ready to infect the next person.
And concerning transmission, of malaria, it's only the female Anopheles mosquito that can transmit it. Can you explain why?
Because you're exactly correct. It's only the females, and it's because they're using the protein to hope to feed their eggs. It's right before they are going to hatch eggs, and in sort of in areas of usually low lying water. But different mosquito species lay their eggs in different types of water.
All right. So the male mosquitoes are just getting nectar or
Right.
whatever. Yeah.
Exactly
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Um,
they're not biting anybody or anything.
right. Right. And the good thing about this is you were very specific. This is mosquito borne, so there's no person to person transmission.
Absolutely not. And while the blood supply is usually not screened for malaria, usually if you're donating blood, it could be transmitted just that blood stage, not the liver stage, and that's why the American Red Cross doesn't accept blood from donations from people who've been outside of the United States.
Um, the signs and symptoms of malaria they vary. Vivax is not the most pathogenic.
Right.
Plasmodium falciparum is. Can you talk a little bit about the signs and symptoms of malaria, things you would look for? How fatal can it be?
For
Questions like.
Sure. Well, I'll work backwards. For fatality for an adult, especially in the United States, your fatality rate is very small. Right, we get just a very small handful of only returning travelers, and it's usually kids. And in the world, it's usually kids who pass away from malaria. Kids under 5. Um, so the symptoms for all malarias are the fever is the big key for us, and especially this cyclic fever. Um, if you if and for Vivax especially, it's you get this deep bone ache. It's like a bone breaking pain. Otherwise, general lethargy, sweating, nausea. It could be sort of I feel like crap. But it's if you have reason to suspect and you've had mosquito bites, then you could talk to your doctor and go to a medical care facility.
Yeah, and one unique thing about Plasmodium vivax is it has the ability to relapse, which some of
Exactly
the
right.
other species don't. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I mentioned that liver stage, that first stage that happens after a mosquito bites you. The Vivax can create a form of it's called a hypnozoite, which is kind of like a spore that hangs out, and it can burst forth 2 weeks later, or a month later, or years later, even. And that stage also requires a different medication in order to treat it and get rid of it. And so, if you don't correctly identify which species of malaria you have, you can get a relapse over and over again. And this actually happened to George Clooney twice, where he was diagnosed with malaria correctly, but not given a different drug to cure that hypnozoite liver stage, and then he got it again when he was on set for some movie. Yeah.
Is there any other unique characteristics about Vivax that we need to know about?
It's Vivax, as far as we know, only has one entry point to get into your red blood cells. It's a receptor called Duffy. And I can go more into this because Case Western Reserve is actually one of the leading research facilities that study this gene.
Yeah, we're going to touch on that, sir. Yeah, we're going to
Yeah,
touch.
sure. But it can only has one entry point into a red blood cell. We think we're working on other ideas. That's why it's ideal we thought it might be ideal for creating a vaccine, but that hasn't worked out. And importantly, a lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa lack this gene completely. So in theory, they don't get Plasmodium vivax at all. Though, however, there have been some cases that we at Case have recently identified in African Americans or Africans who are Duffy negative. They can still get some small level of vivax, but otherwise, it's mostly a disease of South America and Northern Africa and Eastern Africa.
Okay, interesting.
Asia, India.
Yeah. I was just going to ask you about Asia. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I remember I interviewed one gentleman. He was in Indonesia, and he did a whole podcast with me on Vivax, and all of its you know uh, intricate details about it. It's a very interesting parasite, right? And
Yes.
so the state of Florida put up a statewide mosquito-borne advisory, even though all the cases have been locally in Sarasota.
Mhm.
As a malaria expert, how much concern do you have about contracting the malaria, and um, you know, and for people that are, say, coming here on vacation, and there's plenty of them,
Sure.
what, how much concern should they have, and is there any prevention that you would recommend, if any?
I would not be overly concerned. Like I said, the odds are pretty low that you're going to get it ever. Um, but regular mosquito and bug precautions would be very effective. If you use DEET or DEET borne or Picardin based bug spray, that'd be very protective from the few mosquitoes. But if you I'm sure nobody wants to stand outside and get bitten all day by a gajillion mosquitoes. So don't do that, and then you'll be fine. Or and so generally not get bitten by a ton of mosquitoes. But I think this is a very isolated thing, and it's probably going to peter out pretty quickly because the CDC is involved. Florida is probably spraying a lot more bug spray around Sarasota, so they're aware of it, and it's not like when you go to a malaria endemic country where you've got to sleep under a bed net, and you've got to wear bug spray all the time, and you're indoors all the time, and you've got to be on prophylactic anti-malarial drugs. Right. Like I do when I go to our research bases. We just treat ourselves for malaria even if we don't have it, and that way we prevent ourselves from getting it. But that's like Eastern Kenya. That's not or Western Kenya. That's not Sarasota, Florida. You just bug spray is going to do just fine for you.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and switch gears to some of your research, and you're doing a lot of amazing work, especially with P. vivax and the Duffy antigen, which you mentioned earlier. Can you talk about what your lab is doing?
Well, the one thing we've been working on for a long time is to try and interrupt the parasite from getting into the red blood cells of Duffy positive people. To create either a vaccine or some small molecule that will interrupt the continuation of that parasite growth in red blood cells. So we've been working on it's mostly antibody based, trying to block the parasites from getting into red blood cells using antibodies. We've developed some tests. We're one of the only places that can effectively culture the parasite in vitro in petri dishes, and so that allows us the chance to observe the number of parasites that get in, how frequently we can block them. But we're one of the few places that's working on that. But we're not close to a vaccine. I don't want to make it sound like that because it's proven to be much more difficult than we originally thought. We thought, well, if there's Plasmodium falciparum, the one that kills everybody, has about a dozen entry points to get into a red blood cell, but again, Vivax only has one known entry point, this Duffy antigen. But we think it may be able to sneak in another way, which is something that's coming out of our work and in the lab, but also coupled with our field work in areas such as Madagascar, where we've seen that people who are Duffy negative, which means they should never get Plasmodium vivax, but turns out they show up at the clinics with this parasite. So we've been studying those people, what's different about them, and what's different maybe about the parasites that live there in Madagascar in particular. Have they found a back door into the red blood cell? And it looks like they have, which is what's been sort of confounding our vaccine efforts.
Yeah, let me ask you another thing about the vaccines, and if this is an issue with creating a vaccine for any of the malaria species, the fact that it's in liver cells for a period of time, then the RBCs for a period of time to me, that sounds like it would make it difficult to make a vaccine.
Right.
So that is part of the problem.
Absolutely. And there is a vaccine that is out there. It's called RTSS, but it's only for children. And you have to get it for at least 4 times over the course of several months. And it doesn't prevent you from getting the parasite and infection. What they're hoping it does is it prevents little kids from dying of the infection.
Yeah.
But unlike what we're working on is to block the parasite from getting into the red blood cells, they're working on blocking it from the mosquito to your liver, that few minutes between when it's in your bloodstream, between the mosquito and the liver. And that's what that vaccine is focusing on. But Americans can't get that, and adults can't even get it right now. But it's something that people are focusing on. But again, part of the deal is you've only got a very short amount of time to attack that parasite while it's circulating in the bloodstream before they hide inside the liver hepatocytes. So you're right. There's many different stages, and that's part of what's making it very difficult. There's many different stages. There's different entry points, and that's what's making vaccines very, very difficult for any of the plasmodiums, any of the malaria.
Dr. Grimberg, what else is your lab doing with plasmodiums? Are you doing anything with therapeutics or diagnostics or any other kind of research?
Sure. One of the big things that we're working on is a rapid diagnostic. Because right now, even if you go to the clinics down in Florida, if you're at a big hospital, they'll take a small drop of blood and they'll smear it out and fix it and stain it, look at it on a microscope, and they'll look for the ring stages. It looks like a purple dot with a ring around it inside of a red blood cell, and that's frequently how they'll diagnose malaria. That takes at least an hour, and maybe in a big hospital it'll take even longer. But then in the rest of the world, they'll frequently have like a pregnancy test for malaria, that you take a drop of blood and you put it on there and you get 2 lines, just like the COVID test. Okay. You get the 2 lines if you're positive, and it's looking for antibodies. And that takes about a half an hour, 20 minutes, even in the field clinic. So what we're working on is a method to diagnose malaria within a minute, and it's also taking a small drop of blood. But what it's looking for is the malaria, as it grows, it eats the hemoglobin and it makes these iron particles. And because it's iron, you can manipulate with magnets. So basically, we take a drop of your blood, we put it into some water, we pop open the red blood cells, and now you've got these free crystals floating around. And if you apply a magnetic field, they all kind of line up and they block a certain amount of light in a magnetic field. But if you take the magnetic field away, then they sort of randomize again. And what we've come up with, the case patented idea, is that you repeatedly expose that blood sample to a magnetic field, and you get less light and lots of light and less light and lots of light as you apply and remove a magnetic field. And so that's an idea that's been launched into a startup called Hemex Health, which is based out in Portland, Oregon, and is now they're starting manufacturing on that in India for sale of that idea.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Hey, let me just piggyback on, you were talking about the field test real quick. How sensitive and specific is that test as compared to a blood smear?
Oh, we look at about 200 parasites per microliter of blood. So you have about 5 million red blood cells in a microliter of blood. So just a small drop. Mm-hmm. So if you can have about 200 parasites per microliter is probably about the lower limit of most of the rapid diagnostics. And then also the microscopy, can really vary around the world. We spend a lot of time training people to read the blood smears. And I've done it, and you have to be out in the field, and it has to be a sunny day, and it can be very difficult based on where you are as how effective you are at detecting malaria. And that was really one of the reasons I came up with this idea to create a faster diagnostic, because I really wanted to help the poor microscopists, because if you're having to read, you've got 200 kids lining up, which just sometimes happens, and you have to screen all of them. That's could be 200 man hours, and plus if the WHO limits the number of samples that each microscopist can look at a day, because you kind of get like retinal burn-in from looking down a microscope, and you lose your effectiveness to make a correct diagnosis drops off pretty quickly. So we have to do a lot of training, and there's a lot of rules, and there's a lot of retraining in order to do that. But my diagnostic was to help the microscopists believe in what their call is, especially if they thought this kid was negative, because if they mistakenly say this person is negative, doesn't have the parasites, they could go home and then die. Basically, it could happen pretty quickly if they're a little kid. So what we found was they were spending all of their time confirming the negative, and so that's really why I wanted to make this diagnostic, to help back them up. But it turned out to be much better than them. So,
excellent.
Yeah,
oh, that's just fantastic news. Well, Dr. Grimberg, any final thoughts on the situation in Florida or in malaria in general?
Well, especially in Florida, there's some conspiracy theories coming out. There has been a release of male mosquitoes in the Keys to combat Zika and dengue, and that with the backing of the Gates Foundation. That has nothing to do with what we're seeing here, because A, they're all males. B, they're a completely different species called Aedes aegypti, and it's also pretty far away from Sarasota. So I want to point out that has nothing to do with what we're seeing here. Two, yeah, go ahead.
Isn't that Oxitec though?
Oxitec, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And then
not related at all.
No. So but it's out there that's people are blaming Bill Gates, even though he doesn't. Yeah. So, well, so yeah, okay, and I don't. So anyway, but those bugs that they were released, Oxitec released, they force a sterilization gene into the subsequent generations, right? That's what they're trying to do, instead of spraying everything. And okay, I get the concept, but that has nothing to do with the spread of malaria here in Florida. The other one is global warming. A lot of people are thinking, is this global warming? It's certainly true that around the world, global warming is increasing mosquito spread, because they can go up to other areas of up higher elevations, which were normally too cold for them. But now, as the world warms, which it is, they can move further and further up the sides of mountains, in particular, into areas that never had malaria before, and so that could be increasing malaria and make around the world and making it harder to defeat malaria, because people who've never had malaria before get it real hard. But that's probably not what's going on in Florida. It's July in Florida. They have bugs. I think no matter what, it was always hot and it was always a swamp, right? So I think they had bugs. It had not a lot to do with global warming in that instance. But the spread around the world and people are returning to travel. And as I said at the top, maybe not the world not thinking as much about malaria, because certainly sleeping or giving away free bed nets, and we used to do indoor spraying of houses, that ended under COVID. So that helped increase the mosquito population around the world. And I don't know if that contributed to more people coming back. We won't know those numbers until next year, really, to see if this was happened to be a higher return of a higher mosquito and malaria parasite year. If this year, we won't know that till next year. But so it's just, I think it's just random chance now, and a little bit taking our eye off the ball globally. But there's still 2,000 people that come back to the United States with malaria, and a lot of them come through Florida. So
yeah, and I would imagine that most states probably have some travel associated malaria. Any place with a large airport, I would.
Sure. Right. LA, Miami, Houston, New York, they're all well versed in malaria. In all of Ohio, in the last 20 years, we've had 88 cases in 20 years of returning travelers. So it's not, but we're also not directly connected to South America. So
yeah.
But they know what to look for in these big hospitals. They know what to look for.
Yeah. All right. Well, good stuff. I want to thank you, Dr. Brian Grimberg, for sharing your time and expertise today. I really appreciate it, sir.
Of course. Thanks for having me.